So thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to Frost & Sullivan's latest webinar from the security research team. As Julieta mentioned there, today's session focuses on the major trends and growth opportunities within the cyber physical system security and operational security industries. My name's Adrian Droz, as Julieta mentioned there. As a side note, we have a team outside of this, about 20 analysts covering the security market. So just a fraction of the team here today to talk you through, but any questions or any requirements outside of the OT side of things, let us know. We'll be very happy to connect as well. So joining me today, Danielle Van Zandt, Research Manager and Program Director for our Global Commercial and Public Security team, and Tobias Folatelli, who's our Research Analyst in that same Commercial and Public Security team. They're going to share their thoughts based on our recent coverage of the CPS and OT cyber markets. We've got some good fresh content coming out on both of those areas at the moment. So just a little introduction before we get into the questions. I mean, over the past, I'd say 2 decades, the OT security ecosystems has really existed in parallel to IT cybersecurity, requiring its own separate but equally secure programs and solutions, really. They've been very separate things, as a lot of you on the call will know. But because OT security solutions have always also been protecting those critical operational systems from, let's be honest, an ever-expanding threat landscape. It's just as bad in the sort of physical domains as the cyber physical as well. OT security has not only accomplished security protection requirements, but it's safeguarded some of those critical business activities and assets. But today, we're seeing that shift in the landscape with the emergence of cyber physical system security programs and solutions that exist in tandem with that OT security side of things, and understanding what that means for business operations and the security landscape at large is really what we want to dive into today. So let's start off, I guess, with a straightforward, maybe, but important question to ensure we're all on the same page. Danielle, maybe I'll throw this one at you first. What are the key differences that we're seeing between that CPS security and OT security, and why have they emerged separately?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, Adrian, that there's been this parallel journey that OT has gone on alongside IT. It's also kind of become an alphabet soup on the OT side, where you would also hear acronyms like, industrial control systems security. So you hear ICS alongside OT security. And then when you have digital transformation in the mix, we started talking about IT-OT convergence. So bringing all of these areas together. And that's kind of been the parallel trajectory. But even as we've brought these more digitized IT systems over, it's not only expanded the threat landscape, but also kind of opened up the idea of, what can we protect outside of, just IT? Now, can we protect our OT systems? But what does that mean for like my building management system or my facilities management system? In the healthcare, and then you bring IoT in the mix, and all of a sudden you have even more letters. And so rather than just kind of keeping the acronym going of like IT, OT, IoT, the market has kind of settled on this more simplified definition of cyber physical systems, which is essentially a digital system that has operational impacts in the physical world. So a lot of times this is already going to be traditional OT systems and like machinery, but also brings in that mix of like the IoT devices, all of these different connected endpoints, but also these additional systems that businesses rely on, whether it's an internal system or something like a building management system. And so what we did with our research this year, because this is the first time that we've separated CPS security from OT and are really trying to show it's not a parallel journey, but more of a branching in the road. Because OT security still definitely has its own place and goals behind their security programs, but CPS security does have some different goals. And as we'll kind of talk through, a couple differences between what you would call a CPS security solution versus an OT security solution. This chart that we came up with in our research really helps to understand what that is. So OT security is really looking to ensure that constant operational continuity. You want to get humans out of the loop as much as possible. CPS security still does require some human involvement. There's also going to be tight integration across the business because you want that visibility over everything that's going on, not just your OT devices and not just these integrated systems, but everything. So you're obviously going to get more complex there. But the functionality, they are pretty similar. You want that operational control, you want that monitoring, but you also want to be able to use this data in a way that doesn't just impact security decisions, but also business decisions. And that's where CPS kind of starts to vary from the OT side.
And
Makes sense.
building off of what Danielle said, looking at it from more like the OT side of things, I think it's really important to emphasize that each side has its own like scope and priorities. So take, for example, like IT, which is really centered on like data processing and information management. OT systems are usually designed to foremost like prioritize safety, reliability, and continuous like uptime. So security strategies in this environment have to really like respect this reality. You can't simply, like patch or scan an industrial control system you would, in IT, because the cost of downtime is like crazy high. So OT and CPS have sort of like emerged like separately. CPS, I think, has like a little bit of like a broader scope. They cover more like enterprise and private sectors use cases, while OT has like a more like mission critical side of managing situations. Um, Even looking at the Frost radar that we're developing, we're looking more at like systems specifically built for, like utilities, transportation, manufacturing, and energy, while CPS may include some more enterprise or even healthcare side of things, which are some more like emerging businesses. So not trying to like repeat ourselves through the chart, but these sort of like key and small differences really set the needs that each program has and each vendor has to provide to its clients to be able to fulfill the needs for uptime and safety, but with different with a different balance among each of the priorities. So it's been really interesting.
Very good. Thank you both for that. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but if you were just to sum up let's say, the unique technology differentiators between CPS and OT, what would be the simple message, or simple as you can make it, let's say?
So the solutions really have to be purpose built for industrial environments.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, one of the things that we've been seeing specifically in OT are the use of like a passive asset discovery and protocol specific monitoring. So say in a factory, a refinery, or power grid, you really can't risk actively scanning devices the way you might do in other systems, because then that could really disrupt operations. So OT platforms are being built to understand industrial protocols and map assets silently without introducing any more downtime. Um, there's some overlap between like CPS and OT protocols and systems, but the, the the thing about being specifically focused on industrial context and prioritizing different features really sort of like sets it apart. For example, in like response mechanisms in IT or CPS, maybe you can shut down or isolate a system. In OT, you really cannot shut down a turbine or halt the metro signaling system. You really have to be able to isolate and segment and have a safe remote access control to those systems to be able to have an effective response.
And actually, a lot of CPS security solutions pretty much have evolved straight up from OT security. So as Toby said, there's a lot of capabilities that are in common. They do prioritize a very similar structure where they want production to continue while security is happening on the back end. One of the biggest differences when it comes to how CPS approaches a lot of the both its security programs, but also how it combats threats, detects threats. It's very much focused on prevention. So really pushing into that proactive security approach rather than reacting to traffic that is already happening in the network. Some of the other key capabilities that really kind of set a solution apart from being an OT security solution versus a CPS solution. Toby mentioned secure remote access, which that has actually been one of the key differentiators, where on a CPS solution, this is almost a requirement at this point. There has to be the ability for security teams, operators to securely access remote assets, systems, especially because some of these systems are not owned by the business, they're third party. Because we're expanding the ecosystem into contracted systems, managed services providers, things like that, at least as far as your perimeter can go. And so that supply chain security aspect, as well as the secure remote access piece of it, those are probably two of the key technology differentiators between OT and CPS right now.
Mm-hmm. We've actually got a question coming in that maybe we can jump into related to this slide. So the question is, OT security has verbally been addressed as mission critical systems, which the poster agrees with. Would not consider some of the examples on this side under OT as OT, but more like IoT. So just, is there anything we can do to clarify what we mean on some of these examples in terms of the OT security column there?
Yeah.
I assume we're talking about smart thermostats, etc., rather than they're not sort of mission critical so much, are they? Is that a mistake, or is it just something that is another part of how we view the OT security side of things?
It's part of the expanded definition of OT, but you're right. There can definitely be more examples. Like Toby said, the turbine for a power generation company, or even like a manufacturing process line. These would be things covered under OT security. CPS would address it as well, but OT security is really prioritizing these kinds of direct production operational systems.
We can follow up on that question as well if you'd like a bit more detail. But let's move on for now. Let me just stop sharing my screen actually, because I think we'll come back to the slides in a little bit. Let's move on to a few other questions. I think the next thing I'd like to look at a little bit, you talked a bit about the technology differences, but one thing that's out there and we talk about, I think, every day in every walk of life at the moment is AI, isn't it? Rapidly transforming the cybersecurity landscape, as we know, and especially, I would say, in environments where physical systems and digital networks are intersecting. Any examples that you can share in terms of specific functions, use cases, where AI is making a meaningful impact in either the OT or the CPS side of things?
So I think one important thing to note is that, especially in OT, the approach to AI, based on our conversations with vendors and customers, has been sort of like a cautious approach to AI adoption and the way that it's being deployed. The focus right now is not on replacing human control, but actually applying AI in some very narrow and high value use cases where it can actually, like support decision making without taking direct command of the process. This really varies vertical by vertical. Some may be more open to it, some may be restricted by regulations, but it's been a cautious approach. So sort of like off the top of my mind, like things where AI is actually being used and sort of like adopted has been in sort of like compliance and reporting. So being able to prepare logs and audit trails for like frameworks or directives, this has been really time consuming. It really takes a lot of time from like highly specialized teams to be able to develop this sort of documentation. So AI being put into the play to be able to prepare this sort of documentation, generate the report, really frees up a lot of time from operators. Another,
Especially if it's like a standardized audit report or log that has to be done for any kind of compliance thing. For example, if an organization has to appeal to multiple compliance regulations, like maybe there's one in their region that they have to do, but also there's one in a specific vertical, like a North American utility company would have to do both NERC CIP, but also maybe has to go with like, CCPA, the California data protections. If the OT solution or the CPS solution, most of the time, sometimes you're able to upload like the compliance reporting format. And so once the system starts being under monitoring, you can run those compliance reports essentially through a Gen AI plugin. And that will allow these reports to be generated much quicker than the compliance team would have, and allows them to go back to, real-time reporting, going back to active threat monitoring and those kinds of tasks. Sorry, Toby, if you had another one.
No,
but
I had sort of like,
that's one that goes over both of us, actually.
yeah, I had one more that it was more like sort of like helping in prioritization on like predictive maintenance and like vulnerabilities, which I think may have some overlap with CPS. But I think the key here is that it's not actively taking control over the systems. It's just making like suggestions and raising alerts and looking at patterns. I don't know if you're going to mention the triage of like different inputs and information, but AI is being used in that sort of way to sort of like help and aid actual human beings, and not taking control of the whole operation, just letting it run by itself.
Yeah, and actually that prioritization aspect, I think this is what Toby was getting at from the CPS side. It helps with like the business operations use case. So moving outside of security rather than just helping with like prioritizing security alerts. It can also monitor behaviors of like, in a healthcare setting, usage behind all of the IoT machines, which could include, robotic machine, surgical robots, medical imaging devices, things like that. And so you can expand this to help with like procurement teams so they can make sure that they're doing adequate inventory of all their devices, or if there's an underutilized machine, but there's some machines in a hospital network that are being overused and their predictive maintenance is going like way below what it should be, then they can start reallocating resources and do that kind of business planning that it's not a security thing, but it's helping with making business decisions based on the data that is already being gathered. So that's another way that AI is really helping. And like Toby said, it's not pushing, it's recommending. So still there's a human within the loop that can make the final decision on whether this policy or this action is something to be moved forward.
Very good. And of course, convergence continues to be a defining theme, I suppose, in both OT and CPS security. IT, OT integration, cyber physical alignment, sort of shaping how organizations of all sorts of company across these sectors are approaching risk and resilience. Why does that trend continue to be so prominent, and what factors are driving its, let's say, persistence in these domains, would you say?
A lot of it
Daniel?
still comes down to that the integrations are still a little imperfect, especially between the IT and the OT side. Legacy devices, especially with how quickly, for example, like IT devices have such a smaller life than OT devices would. And now you're introducing a whole new crop of, IoT devices and endpoints that their life cycle is completely different from other devices. So the integrations still remain imperfect. So sometimes gaining visibility still remains really hard. And that's the first step for either OT security or CPS security. And customers know this is the first goal that they need to achieve. So once they understand that, it's moving up to finding, okay, how do I prove this use case? And for example, there's top-down pressure of executives know that there's going to be a potential hack on them. They know their risk is coming. They want to prevent it from happening. But it's this divide of, okay, how do we prove the investment? Because so much of security usually is like, we saved the potential of this happening. And for a lot of OT and CPS systems, they're able to provide these answers. And so being able to show that return on investment, and then, but in order to show it, you have to know everything that's connected in your environment. And that still remains a challenge.
Yeah, and building off of this, I think one important sort of like basic element to know is that the attack surface has really expanded with systems being more interconnected, and sort of the way that attacks have been carried out are OT attacks have some elements of IT attacks. So the convergence is really there, and it's really happening. So this sort of expanded attack surface with more and more systems interconnected, especially in CPS with more IoT, 5G, those sort of technologies are really making systems more vulnerable to these sort of attacks. And one thing that we can sort of like cover on later if we have the time is sort of like the challenges that cultures and teams within a same organization between the IT team and the OT team have in like being able to work together and sort of like try to speak the same language, because they have different priorities and different mindsets. In IT, it's really like do a quick patch and change cycles, while the OT team is really like, wait, we cannot have any downtime. We have to be careful about safety and keeping uptime and production up. So these sort of like two words are sort of like trying to come together. It really depends on the vertical that you're talking to, but it's definitely something that's happening, and it's a challenge.
I suppose following on from that a little bit about the internal politics, let's say, I mean, customer education is important as well, isn't it? It's been a bit of a shared trend between OT and CPS over the last, nearly a decade, I'd imagine, really. But it seems like the goal of those educational efforts is kind of changing, evolving a little bit. What are you seeing there, the focus of the education, let's say? Danielle, do you want to go?
Yeah, so, and I was kind of alluding to this in my last answer, where a lot of customers realize it's no longer a question of them wondering why they need OT security or CPS security. They know that they're at risk for something and that they need to do some kind of protective preventative measure. And so now we've moved from just educating them about why they need it to, okay, where do you start? Because for so many of them, it can almost feel like, the old idiom of like how to eat an elephant. Figuring out where to start, what are the tangible steps to start going forward from there. And that's really the part that a lot of customers are looking for a vendor partner to step in. Not necessarily from like a full managed service, but to be there for the customer to teach them when and where to make these steps in how to integrate, what should they start with, where can they start. And that's been the main focus of a lot of the education, particularly in the last 5 years, I would say. It started to make that shift.
Yeah. And I think another really interesting thing that we noted throughout our studies and reports is that some non-traditional industries and even organizations that are not that large or heavily regulated are looking at the risk, and they're like saying, hey, I need to start preparing for this. I don't know where to start. So we are seeing a lot of organizations adopting regulations that maybe apply to the transportation sector, or apply to oil and gas or utilities, and try to bring them into their own policies and frameworks, and try to strengthen their systems and security that way. And so vendors have to be really aware of this, of building, like stepping stones for organizations to start building up their system, because you cannot just jump in and bombard them with 100 different features and regulations and frameworks, but be able to build up the system as it's needed, prioritizing, looking at the vulnerabilities, and sort of like being really a partner in embracing this new age of threats.
Indeed. I suppose as well, I mentioned at the start, we're kind of recently published some CPS research, some fresh stuff. We've got OT Cyber coming out very soon, haven't we? So you've both got some fresh ideas about kind of the areas that stand out where there's most opportunity in terms of industry segments and regions. Talk me through some of that. Where are you seeing the biggest opportunities, both for CPS and OT? I know we've got a slide that I can bring up
Yeah,
while you're talking here.
We have
Yeah,
a
let
little
me bring
slide
that up as well.
with the numbers.
Yeah.
Even
Well,
better. I'll bring that up.
Well, and interesting enough,
Okay.
for both CPS and for OT security, this was true for both me and Toby in our research. Asia Pacific and Latin America were both like the top 2 standout regions for us that were actually above the global CAGRs. So like on the CPS side, you can see here APAC is at 17.4%. My actual CAGR was about 15. So APAC is definitely the big region of focus right now. LATAM as well, but they're very different reasons. So what I'm seeing on the CPS side when it comes to APAC, they had always been kind of slow. When I say slow, I mean maybe more studious. They were always kind of watching what North America and Europe was doing and weren't really pulling the trigger yet to really fortify their defenses. That has completely changed. They have become much more active in looking to protect their entire ecosystems. We're seeing a lot of like global CPS and OT vendors who are starting to open big regional hubs in the APAC region. So they understand that there's going to be a competitive market here. And then we're also seeing a lot of homegrown APAC vendors who are really showcasing their expertise and kind of taking a little bit of a first mover advantage by getting those local partnerships to maybe start getting ahead of a couple of the global ones. And then on the Latin America side, a lot of their push has really come from that wanting to prevent and potential losses. Because for them, what's going on is they have unfortunately been the victim of a lot of these attacks. And so they are trying to prevent this as much as possible.
And looking at the sort of like more OT side of things, really building off the last thing that I noted being like, so looking at Europe and North America, those markets are really more developed. They have a lot more regulations, and they're like further developed in their security developments. Looking at Asia Pacific and Latin America, they're being aware of the risk and they're trying to embrace new policies and new frameworks to work off of that. So looking at Asia Pacific, also one of my, if the highest growing area in my report, the expansion is really coming from sort of like massive infrastructure investments, sort of like rapid industrialization, and really like government-backed cybersecurity mandates in countries, like Japan, Singapore, Australia. So they're seeing the risks and they're sort of like trying to start investing in OT cybersecurity. And looking at Latin America, really a big driver here, interesting or not, is renewable energy projects. I'm based in Argentina, and we've been seeing quite a lot in Argentina, Chile, and even Brazil, sort of like having to secure the systems. And really, another key thing and driver here has been multinational organizations really imposing stricter cybersecurity requirements in their supply chain. So actually demanding that the whole of the supply chain is secure from end to end. So this is also like pushing organizations here to strengthen their security.
Yeah. And then on the vertical side, for CPS security, what was kind of interesting is our big growth is coming out of like the enterprise vertical and the healthcare vertical, which are kind of non-traditional markets that would be for like straight up OT security. And one of the main reasons behind this is they want to take advantage of those business operations benefits that we talked about earlier. So the ability to take all of this security data that is already being gathered, but use it to make business decisions to help with like procurement and resource optimization. Also, these companies have always known that they were at risk of some OT style threats or CPS style threats, but they never felt comfortable enough to really push for the traditional OT cyber solution. However, with CPS and it kind of having this dual role, that has been their main push to start integrating a lot of these systems. And really, those two verticals have been much of the main focus for a lot of CPS vendors. They're seeing a lot of growth in these industries.
Yeah.
Sticking, yeah. Sorry, Toby, go ahead. I've got
No.
another question, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah, no, there's sort of like similar trends happening in the OT space, especially for these two market verticals. One thing that I wanted to note, especially in the industrial segment, is that really sort of like autonomous fleets, digital twins, and those sort of systems are really, like expanding the attack surface. So they're requiring stronger cybersecurity controls in their spaces. And sort of like looking at the manufacturing side, really, like industry 4.0 initiatives. So, like robotics and connected production systems, and really, again, like supply chain pressure are really driving investment in both of these verticals.
I was going to dig in a little bit more into what Daniel mentioned about sort of growth opportunities for the vendors as well. So you touched on it a little bit there, but what are the big opportunities for the CPS and OT vendors? I think you talked about the benefits for the end customer. Let's say there's some clear kind of directions there. What are the opportunities for the vendors? And if you can throw in some names of vendors that you think are doing particularly interesting stuff, I'm sure that's always of interest to people as well. So anyone who's doing anything noteworthy, different, targeting different verticals, throw that on the table as well if you can. Toby, maybe you start.
So looking at the growth opportunities for the sector, really one of the first one that we're seeing, it really stems from the whole IT/OT debate, is platform consolidation. So operators really have a lot of vendors providing different systems and different platforms. And one of the main priorities for organizations has been to consolidate and reduce the number of platforms that they're working with. So really all vendors that are able to provide IT and OT are really in a good space here to grow and be able to turn their IT customers into also OT customers, and sort of like the other way around. A second one has to really be sort of like operational roadmaps. So building up these like organizations being overwhelmed by the number of vulnerabilities and frameworks, being able to provide guidance, step-by-step plans, and really a system that is able to build up from the bottom up is a really huge growth opportunity. Thirdly, has to be sort of like targeted AI features. So being able to have systems that don't relegate all the control, but are actually able to help and aid and reduce time. As a fourth, growth opportunity has to be. This is a challenging one and a tricky one, because there's more demand for AI features, but the thing is that we don't really have a lot of OT specific data to be able to develop OT specific AI features. So these are really, like fragmented environments, really proprietary data sets, and vendors that are actually able to take this sort of information and build a huge data set of OT-specific information. It has to do with vulnerabilities, threats, frameworks, protocols, all those bits of information to develop actually focused AI solutions in that space. Could really set them up for really big growth. I think Dragus is doing a really good work in this space. They have a really vast sort of like a data set of information that they have like systems where they share information among different vendors. I think Forescout is also doing some really interesting stuff with AI. And as a final growth opportunity, trying to not go for too long, but it's really a space that has a lot of growth opportunities and interest, is that sort of OT has a lack of highly trained workforce. There's really a demand for highly trained teams to be able to deploy. So looking at from like a service point of view, or vendors that have the ability to have a quick response team to be able to jump in the event of a threat or an alert, sort of like an on-demand response team service, maybe through a retainer model or something like that, could really help sort of like strengthen the security of organizations. So here I'm looking at more like consulting forward firms, like ServiceNow recently acquired a couple OT vendors, and they really have a team that is sort of like on standby, ready to deploy. So those are like the main ones that we have identified. I don't know, Danielle, and CPS.
Actually, I'm going to expand on two of yours, Toby, because they really are the main push points in CPS as well. With the targeted AI functionality, as Toby said, a lot of vendors don't want to give up full control, but they do want to have some of that, especially to help with the workforce and reducing operator fatigue. I would echo everybody that Toby mentioned, but then you can also throw in additional leaders like Nozomi Networks and Armis. Both have been making really big strides on improving their AI accuracy with both vulnerability detection, prioritization, but also moving into that active threat hunting space. Not necessarily Nozomi, but like Armis. And then you've also got vendors like TX1 who are doing a really good push into that detection and response capability. And then echoing what Toby was saying about like, OT specific or even CPS specific managed services, that has been kind of a smaller growth area, but the interest in these more on-demand teams that can jump in when there's an incident or when companies expect that maybe there's a threat coming their way. So for example, if a healthcare system feels that they're going to be targeted, or an enterprise maybe feels that they're under some kind of threat, they can call upon like a Dragos or a like 1898 is another good example of an OT service provider, to kind of almost give them surge protection to augment their existing teams and then maybe step back. So it's not kind of an always on service, but it's one that can be tapped as needed.
Very good. We covered a lot of ground today. Any final thoughts, either of you? Any thoughts on where the markets are heading in the next 12 to 18 months? I know you've talked about AI and many of the other kind of areas of development. I imagine that's on the list as well. Anything else, just to summarize?
I think what I'm kind of watching at the moment is trying to see where the divide between the vendors is at the moment, because they do have so many capabilities in common, but I'm starting to see this little kind of, the vendor landscape has never like gone more specific than an OT security vendor or a CPS security vendor. I'm starting to see this potential for a split between like, OT or CPS detection and response vendors, or CPS, vulnerability management providers. It's not formally dividing yet, but I'm starting to see commonality trends where I can see the groups forming. And so watching to see when that potential split starts to happen is something I'm going to be keeping an eye on.
From my point of view, what I've really been looking at, and I'm planning on the next year and 18 months, as you said, is looking at these more like emerging markets, so Latin America and Asia Pacific, and looking at like medium, large organizations, not the top players, but actually the medium segment, and seeing how they are embracing, sort of like starting to build up their OT cybersecurity solutions. And not just looking at, like at Europe, but the US that are really at the top of the game, in regulations and sort of like developing systems, but looking at how these smaller vendors are handling the new requirements from supply chain, from their own country new regulations, or from their own interest in avoiding scandals and stopping production.
Very good. I think that just about wraps it up. I'm going to hand back to Julieta just to wrap things up. I think we've got a quick poll question, some contact details, and yeah, thank you all for joining.